All right. Hello. This is the second part of the lecture on social stratification. So I'll just get into it. I'll share my screen. Share. Okay. So we left off on global stratification. There's particular terms that might be applied here in describing nations. Common ones is first world, second world, third world, same as most industrialized versus least industrialized nations. Alternative terms that can be used here to describe certain nations is and distinguish nations from other nations is developed, underdeveloped, or developing. All these terms are well and okay. There are some critiques of them, though, and so I prefer Mohanty's classifications in understanding nations because the biggest critique of these terms is that they tend to define nations by how developed they are. And that further distinguishes the developed nations from the underdeveloped or developing nations, implying that there's something missing from the underdeveloped or least industrialized nations, or that their culture is not as developed, if you will, as developed nations. Another critique of this simple is that the simple critique is that you will also have developed nations like the United States that have a lack of a proper healthcare system. And so that's something to consider when you use terms like developed or underdeveloped, right? Is that you just might have developed nations like the United States that practically is pretty underdeveloped in certain states and areas. And so it's important to understand that and critically look at these terms and why we use them. But again, I prefer Mohanty's classifications here. According to Mohanty, she has two particular terms. She uses north, south. This refers to affluent, privileged nations and communities versus one-third and two-thirds worlds. She further applies this as regions. That's what's really key here with her definition here is where these nations are, globally speaking, and that's how they are referred to as north or south, right? Or one-third or two-third. And so global stratification, some models for global stratification includes the world systems theory. This is a theory of how economic and political connections developed, now tied the world's countries together. This refers to the core, semi-peripheral, and peripheral nations, if you will. Kind of, again, regioning out certain global areas. And then you have the Human Development Index, the HDI. This measures education, life expectancy, and income. And so, what you further might find throughout understandings of global statistics is which countries live the longest, which countries have the highest income, which countries have the highest education rate, and the like there, right? So, that's also what you might be curious about in terms of global statistics. So, nations become stratified through certain processes. The first one here is colonialism. I referred to this term in part one, didn't properly define it, so here's the definition here. Colonialism is the process by which one nation takes over another nation, usually for the purpose of exploiting its labor and natural resources. This has been seen historically speaking, um, for example, in South Africa, when Europe came over and colonized South Africa. and the like. And so you have seen this throughout history. The purpose of colonialism, first and foremost, was to establish and is to establish because we, I, in my understanding of colonialism, it is still going on. And so it's important to use current, up-to-date terminology for something like colonialism. And so the purpose of colonialism was and is to establish economic colonies, to exploit the nation's people and its resources for the benefit of the elites of the mother country. And so this was seen in the case of Europe, exploiting Africa of its particular resources. And then you have globalization of capitalism is another important term here. It is the adoption of capitalism around the world. It's the adoption of this particular ideology around the world. Neocolonialism is the economic and political dominance of the least industrialized nations by the most industrialized nations, if that makes sense. So, going back to my example previously, Europe is and was considered most industrialized here and colonized Africa, who during that time was considered least industrialized. Just one example. Um, Multinational corporations or companies that operate across many national boundaries also help to maintain the global dominance of the most industrialized nations. Stated differently, these are companies and corporations that are founded and operated across borders and boundaries. And it is found globally speaking. You can think of major big corporations and companies, and they are more often than not, they're multinational corporations. Intersectionality is an important term to note. Um, Intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorization. In definition of conflict theory really, really helped to further establish intersectionality as its own theory. And so when you apply an intersectional lens, you are seeing the interconnected nature of social categories like race, class, gender. Stated differently, intersectionality understands that human beings are complex. It's not just our race that defines us, but it's also our class, it's also our gender. And all of these weave together to form a particular identity that's so specific to each person, right? And so, again, stated a different way, my experience as a white woman looks completely different than that of a white man or black woman. The list goes on here, right? And so that's a specific identity tied to multiple categories of myself and my social categories. And so intersectionality understands that stratification, the interconnected nature of stratification, helps to create complex systems of advantages and disadvantages. Just chew on the term for now. Just chew on it. So, think for a second, but how might intersectionality here affect an individual's advantage of social stratification? Just think on it, chew on it. Let me see if there's. I'm gonna focus on this, and then I want to talk about poverty. So this is going to be a pretty brief video. Social class is a large group of people who rank close to one another in property, power, and prestige, according to Weber. One of the two groups is the capitalists who own the means of production and the workers who sell their labor, according to Marx. Weber, I've said this before, viewed this system as more complex, that it was more than two groups here, that social class uh, included a lot of different groups. And then some consequences of social class here include physical health, mental health, family life, education, religion, politics, crime, and criminal justice. So, getting further into it, if we consider social stratification here, some consequences that might arise from social stratification that also has been noted, mostly by conflict theorists, are a perpetuation of inequality across generations, limited social mobility, that leads to discrimination, unequal access to resources and opportunities, health disparities, and differences in life expectancy. This is also seen. This is further underscored by the statistical fact that uh, upper middle class people or middle class people tend to live longer than lower class people, and that is statistically true. Political polarization and social unrest is also part of social stratification here. Global stratification leads to and might lead to economic disparities between nations and a continuation of economic disparities. Because if you have the most industrialized nations taking resources from the least industrialized nations, that in turn keeps those least industrialized nations poor or impoverished. And so that's an example of economic disparities that are continued throughout generations. There is also differences in quality of life and access to basic necessities, variations in educational and health outcomes, as well as migration patterns and brain drain. Brain drain here is a term in reference to immigrants who choose to move to places like the United States, but in turn, they are moving away from their homeland, thus they're it's a brain drain, right? They're moving to the United States to earn a higher education and to work here, but it's a brain drain because they're moving from their homeland. It's a term, I believe, developed by sociologists here to describe that particular phenomenon. Okay. I will most likely post this video. It's essentially an overview of why the US can't solve poverty, what exactly that looks like specific to the US, what poverty looks like, what it has historically looked like, and the like. I'll post this to Canvas. And then some important terms further. Um, is material possessions includes animals, bank accounts, bonds, buildings, businesses, cars, commodities, furniture, jewelry, land, stocks. This all can represent someone's wealth as well as property, right? Um, Wealth here is a different definition to income. Wealth is the total value of everything someone owns, minus the debts. Income is money received, usually from a job, business, or assets. Income is not as substantial as wealth here, and wealth can be built up. It also can be transferred through generations. And so you can have wealth that is transferred from a father to his son or a mother to her daughter, right? Um, that's different than income here. We're kind of getting into poverty and certain ideologies and understandings of poverty and people who are poor. This kind of weaves into my social work course because I teach that as well. And so the individual myth is that each individual should work hard and strive to succeed in competition with others. Also, is in reference to those who work hard should be rewarded with successes such as wealth, property, prestige, and power. Because of extensive employment opportunities and because of equal opportunity legislation. Those who work hard will, in fact, be rewarded with success, but that is not always the case, especially when a society is so socially stratified. Economic failure is an individual's, and according to this myth, not according to me, economic failure is an individual's fault and reveals a lack of effort and other character defects. The individualism myth here kind of is flawed because it removes the aspect of structural inequality and issues here, and how it might be more of a structural issue rather than an individual issue. Because for sociologists, we more so highlight the environment around us, right? We understand that the environment can sometimes impact a person beyond their control. And their situation can be so detrimental that they might be stuck in that situation long term. And it's not necessarily their own individual failure that they found themselves in that situation to begin with, according to sociologists. So, I posted this video on Canvas. I can post the other one. It's a further understanding of the paradox of poverty, how one would escape poverty. And so I highly recommend this video. It's very educational in understanding what poverty looks like for an individual to go through and how it is further hard to get out of poverty. Because there's a famous quote that it essentially says that it's more expensive to be poor. That's I forget which theorist says that, but it's a very famous quote and it rings very true for people who are poor and impoverished and their experiences with being poor. Poverty, cultural poverty, is the assumption that the values and beliefs of the poor make them fundamentally different from other people, that these factors are largely responsible for their poverty, and that perpetuate poverty across generations by passing these characteristics to their children. Thus, further understandings of the cycle of poverty, right? Absolute poverty is the lack of resources necessary for well-being. Most importantly, food and water, but also housing, sanitation, education, and healthcare. Absolute poverty is a measure here. It's how one might understand those who are in poverty and what exactly that looks like, right? By measuring, it also helps to measure poverty, how impoverished someone is, especially when you consider basic necessities here. Because when I ask, for example, my class, what do basic necessities look like for a family, my students' answers vary every time. And the baseline is that basic necessities gets at food, water, but it goes beyond that point, right? It gets at basic needs, right? It gets at the needs of individuals like sanitary environments that don't harm them. That's also an aspect of this, right? Or it gets at basic education and the access to education, or the access to healthcare and the access to being able to get a particular shot, right? And being able to afford that. Or being able to live in a safe house that makes you feel comfortable. That's a basic necessity. And as the video notes in the United States, there are people who don't have basic necessities and they don't live in houses that are environments that are good for them or safe or or they don't live in highly sanitized environments, or they don't have access to education because they can't afford it, right? Or they can't afford health care and they're just and they might have a continual disease, right, that they have to deal with day in and day out. And so that's another measure of poverty and a further understanding of it. Relative poverty is the lack of material and economic resources compared to some other population. This is more of a comparison here. It's comparing material and economic resources between populations and what exactly that looks like. Populations here would be, for example, you could compare and contrast lack of material and economic resources between white people in a population and black people within a population. And that would be understandings of relative poverty in connection to race and ethnicity, right? That's one example of what you could look at with relative poverty and how you could measure poverty in that way. Getting further into it, again, I'm just kind of priming you on this. So, another element to measure poverty here is an understanding of extreme poverty, what extreme poverty looks like. And for extreme poverty, this is people who are living on less than $1.90 a day. That's considered extreme poverty, right? Um, I showed I show this to every class, the poverty thresholds. I can also post this to Canvas. If you're really curious, highly recommend checking it out. It looks at the poverty thresholds for a family, right? A family, a single person living alone versus um, a couple living by just by themselves versus a three-family household, and what that threshold looks like, how much they make yearly, and what that looks like in the United States particularly. But it's also helps to understand what extreme poverty looks like for a family and an individual. Because when you see numbers like 15 a person makes $15,000 a year, you might think to yourself, how do you pay rent with that money? How do you do anything with that money? How do you pay groceries with that money? And those are real questions that people who go through extreme poverty, they have to think about. Um, and so I just like that statistic because it numbers speak for themselves a lot of times. So that's why I include that statistic. Multidimensional poverty index is a measure of serious deprivation in the dimensions of health, education, and living standards. Serious deprivation here gets at um sorry, my cats just made a sound and I thought they were doing something in the kitchen. Um they were getting up to no good. Um but serious deprivation here, for example, imagine you're a social worker and you are visiting a home. Uh, and you are visiting these children in this home, and they're part of your caseload. And so you go to this home, make your visit, walk in the doors, and immediately you smell cat urine and feces. And you barely can get through the walkway of the home because the whole house is littered in garbage and the whole floor is covered. And as you're walking through this home, the smell of cat pee becomes stronger, stronger. You notice there's cat pee on the floor, there's cat fur everywhere. Um, there's cat poo on the floor. And so you start to notice this, and it's very evident in this home. And then you further get to the kids' rooms, but they don't have rooms. It's a shared room, and let's say it's a shared room and one bedroom, but they don't have beds. There's no mattress. It's just blankets on the floor with a pillow. That is deprivation and serious deprivation because that child does not have a place to sleep. They don't have a bed. That is a lack of sleep leads to a lot of different issues for an individuals, but that's not the only serious thing here, right? You also have the unsanitary nature of the home, it being covered in feces and the smell of urine, cat urine, and the aspect of trash all over the floor, right? That can bring insects and mold and the like here. And so it is unsustainable for a person to be living there, let alone children to be living there and not feel comfortable in that space, right? That is the standard here. In a lot of ways, that's a standard that someone who is trained in the field like social work would look for. Something that is just comfortable for a person, in other words. And that's also gives you an image of what serious deprivation might look like and what that might include within that definition. So, who is poor? Um, People who are poor are, statistically speaking, in poverty, unemployed. Um, a large majority of people who are poor, there's a huge misunderstanding here, are children, kids. And those are kids who are not being fed properly every day and can't meet every meal. That's the statistic that you're looking at for people who are poor. I also just really want to nail this because there's a common misconception made about people who are poor, that they're lazy, that they don't do anything, and the like here. And I want to squash that because you're also, with this statistic, if you are, if your thought process is that people who are poor are lazy, then you're calling children who are poor lazy, and that they're in that situation because they chose to be, which is false, right? So I think that's important to note within the statistic and this understanding of poverty. Um, particular cities, you find more poor people than other cities, and you can measure poverty through that, as well as population demographics. So one family households, children, large family households, people of color, homeless, um, you tend to find more instances of poverty. And some of those intersect, right? You might have a large family household uh, who are of a particular ethnicity, or a one-parent household who are of a particular age, right? Or demographic. And so you're also looking at those specific social categories when you're looking at poverty. Because it gives a face to something, right? It further helps you understand something that's extremely important as poverty. Marginalized groups are part of this statistic and demographic breakdown, but it's important to note that not everyone who is part of the marginalized group or considered a marginalized group likes to be called marginalized. So keep that in mind. This is a group of people who have been regulated to lower echelons, outer edges or margins of society, essentially pushed out of a particular society in such characteristics like gender, economic status, education, culture, race, religion, ethnicity, or political affiliation. This is also where you find segregation in certain cities and areas. That people of who are marginalized in a specific society are segregated also in that society, and that keeps them impoverished. Okay, another element of this is health, hunger, and poverty. So living in poverty is linked to hunger and malnourishment. This is a huge statistic, and it makes sense, right? Uh, to be able to afford, right, proper nutrients, you need to be able to buy particular groceries, and you further need to live next to a grocery store. Um, in the United States, we have certain areas that lack grocery stores, and so people can't even go to a grocery store in their city. And so they have to go to a convenience store to get their food. And that is not nutritious by any means. And so that's also a structural issue that affects an individual beyond their control. Food insecurity or food insecure is when a household has a difficult time providing enough food for all of its members. Inequality, like poverty, increases stress and anxiety. And so when you're in poverty, you're also having to deal with aspects of inequality as well. And so with that, that brings stress, anxiety, and the like. Um, and stress and anxiety also brings in a lot of health problems as well, like heart issues, as tied to something like stress and anxiety. Um, so think on this, chew on it. How might stress and anxiety contribute to health problems? What are some examples that are coming to mind already when you're thinking about this question? All right, last thing are myths of poverty. First one, first myth. People who receive welfare are lazy, have no work ethic, and prefer to have a free ride on welfare rather than work. This is not true. As I mentioned before, children are part of the statistic. You also have people who are on disability who are part of the statistic. And so it's important to be aware of who you're talking about when you're trying to label groups of people. Fraud and abuse are rampant in the welfare system. That is not fully true, right? And understanding how the welfare system works, but it's again, take it with a grain of salt, right? It's also important to understand how fraud and abuse might emerge out of a welfare system and what exactly that looks like. Welfare benefits are granted to many people who are not really poor, eligible to receive them. That is, statistically speaking, not true. Most, if not all, people who are on welfare need to be on welfare. Welfare makes people dependent on the government and prevents them from becoming contributing citizens. This is also a myth. Um, Immigrants place a huge burden on our welfare system. This is a very topical issue, but this is also a myth. Immigrants have provided a lot for nations like the United States, and it's because immigrants were so hardworking that we have a lot of benefits within our given society, like in the United States. So it's important to recognize that. Okay, that is it for this lecture. So let me close out. Stop sharing. All right. So make sure you watch part one, and then if you're watching this, you already watched part two. So um, I have my window open, so that's why you can hear the kind of traffic outside. So apologies if that's bothering you throughout this video. All right. Have a good day, and I'll see you next week. So I won't see you, but I'll be posting a video. So.